Hi, Anki. Great question. I spent about 5 years researching the Spanish-Mexica War for the Serpent and the Eagle. I wrote my undergraduate history thesis on the Spanish-Mexica War, and a lot of that same research that I used for that thesis was really helpful for me in terms of figuring out how I should make sure that The Serpent and the Eagle was a historical novel that was very grounded in fact and the most current research. I decided to write about the Spanish-Mexica War because I thought it was really interesting from the very first time I learned about it. I first learned about the event in my AP World History class, and I remember thinking to myself, that's interesting." And I didn't really revisit that interest for a long time. But then I enter college, and I'm thinking to myself, I should branch out into a new genre when it comes to writing. In the past, I pretty much only wrote science fiction, and I was majoring in history, so I figured maybe it'd be good to write about that event I learned about in world history way back in the day. And I took it upon myself to go out to a local bookstore and get all the books that I could regarding the Spanish-Mexica War. And I was really just blown away by how much of what I thought was true about the event, which just wasn't. And I think, at least for me personally, the point of studying history is to challenge your assumptions and to broaden your horizons. And I think that's exactly what happened for me when I was doing research for the Spanish-Mexica War. I had this very simple, and I had this uh, very easy to remember narrative regarding how the Spanish-Mexica War unfolded, who triumphed, who lost, why they won, etc., etc. And once I started digging into the weeds a little bit more, once I started doing the research, I learned that a lot of what I thought was true about the Spanish-Mexica War wasn't. And that was really interesting to me and made me want to delve into the subject even further. It's really hard to say which character I like the best. I would say, in terms of exploring a POV, I really like Melence's POV. I really um, appreciate how much insight she can give into not just how the Amerindian peoples might have perceived the Spanish, but I also think she's really useful for providing insight into Amerindian culture in the sense that she doesn't come from all that privileged a background. She has a lot more of a rustic background than a lot of the other characters who we know about from historical sources, characters like Montezuma or Cuauhtemoc, for example. And I think because of that, she brings a lot to the table in terms of information to offer. Having said that, I also feel like I poured a lot of myself into Vitali. And while I wouldn't say that his POV uh, engages me the same way that Melince's does, there's definitely more personal details from my own life, I think, with Vitali's point of view, and I really enjoyed the way Vitali and Solomon would work off of each other, much the same way that I enjoy that the way Melince and Aguiar work off of each other. I really enjoy scenes where I can have two foils play off of one another, so to speak. I think what inspired me to include those kind of discussions was my own personal reflection upon some of the information I learned while reading about the Spanish-Mexica War. So I think a really great example of this is Camilla Townsend's Melanson's Choices mentions the slave women who were handed over to Cortez's men after his victory at the Battle of Potonchan and the Central Plains area specifically once all the battling has been wrapped up. And I remember she made a point to mention that the Spaniards insisted that all the women convert to Christianity before they could enter into marriage rites, and what that sort of revealed about Spanish mentality and Spanish attitudes towards towards women, and even to the rights and autonomy of women in Amerindian society, or women being incorporated into Spanish society. And what really struck me about Camilla Townsend's take on the subject was she was a lot more explicit in highlighting the contradictions and highlighting the problematic mentality of the Spaniards regarding the treatment of these women and the forced conversions. And it really struck me because I'd read about that same event in multiple takes in multiple books on the same subject. So I read about it in Hugh Thomas's Conquest. I read about it in Buddy Levi's Conquistador. I read about it in numerous other books that chronicle the same events, but I don't think any of them gave it the same attention that Townsend did. But I really appreciated the attention that Townsend gave it, and I wanted readers who are interested in the subject to be able to ponder some of the same questions I was asking myself after reading Camilla Townsend's book. And that's just one example. But there are a lot of different times where I'd read something really interesting in whatever source I had to consult to write the Spanish-Mexica War. And I wanted to make sure readers weren't just passively accepting the information, that there was a little bit of a critical analysis. And I think for me that's why it's important to insert those discussions into the book. I think the conversation is inspired in many respects not just by the contemporary norms of the early 16th century, but also some of the contemporary norms of today. I think that issue of clothing and sort of what it reveals about identity, what it reveals about power, what it reveals about status, I think is something that has been with us for a long time and will probably be with us for a long time still. And it reveals a lot about culture and it reveals a lot about mentality. And I just felt like I had to include it just because it's so revealing in terms of giving insight into how the Spanish looked at the world compared to the way the Mexica looked at the world. I don't really, I guess the only terms that would have really been used besides the word Indian at that time would have been words even more, even less so politically correct these days. Like the term like savage would have been used very often, the term a little bit later, not quite the 1500s, but closer to like the 1700s, you start getting the term brave being used more often. But by and large, and this deals a lot with Columbus, Indian was the term that really stuck when it came to a lot of the indigenous people of the Americas. Yeah, so the symbolism for the serpent and eagle is inspired by Spanish culture as well as Mexica culture. So in Spanish culture, and this is also true for a lot of Western countries, the serpent is in many respects tied to the Garden of Adam and Eve. And I recognize that the way serpent is often perceived in Western culture is sort of this bringer of sin, this evil lurking force. And I thought that was really interesting and something that was worth bringing a little bit of attention to with the constant comparisons to the serpent with various Spanish characters. So Cortés, for example, gets compared to various types of snakes all throughout the book. The Amerindian people, oftentimes when thinking about the Spanish, I'll kind of make a snake comparison. And I want readers to think about that snake connection because in many respects, I think the Spaniards did operate as the snake in the metaphorical Garden of Eden. Now, I do want to be clear. I'm not trying to say that Mesoamerica was some sort of Mecca in terms of nonviolence and that there was no sort of bloodshed prior to the arrival of the Spanish. I mean that just in a theological sense, it's very interesting, to me at least, the way that the concept of Christian sin didn't really exist in Mesoamerica. And in order for the Spanish to root out what they considered sinful, and keep in mind what they considered sinful is not exactly always stuff we would consider sinful today. A prime example being homosexuality was something the Spanish considered very sinful. Mesoamerican people, not so much. But in any case, I think it's really interesting, this contradiction that sort of exists with Spanish theology in terms of, in order to eradicate something, first they have to introduce it in the first place. And to me, that's a really interesting question to ponder, whether or not something goes by a certain name, whether or not it ought to be treated in one way or another. I also was very inspired by Amerindian symbolism, though, and that's why I also include the eagle. Now, the serpent and the eagle are both very important in Mesoamerican symbolism and Mesoamerican theology. And the creation legend for why Tenochtitlan was founded where it is that the Mexica people saw a eagle clutching a serpent and its hounds perched atop a cactus. Now, if you ask some people, it's just a eagle perched atop a cactus. It really does depend upon which historian you ask. But I just thought it was really interesting to come up with a title that could incorporate theological symbolism, cultural motifs that are resonant with both Spanish people, with both European people, with both Mexica people, with both Mesoamerican peoples, to sort of give an example of what I'm trying to do with my story, and that is weave in multiple perspectives to give a richer understanding. So I would say one of the best, I would say in many respects, the inspiration for Donna Marina and Donna Marina, who's also known by Melince, being deceptive, comes from Matthew Vestal. In his book, Seven Myths of the Spanish Conquest, he talks about how it's sort of just taken for granted that Melince faithfully rendered every translation she was ordered to translate, and why maybe we should not take it for granted that all those translations were verbatim exactly the way they should have been translated. And just from a logical perspective, and I think Camilla Townsend also hints at this a little bit, I think there's a good reason to think that Melince would have felt a good reason to maybe not do exactly what the Spanish wanted her to do when it came to either tense situations or when it came to simple greetings with differing peoples, with dialogues with representatives for Multicazoma or representatives for some of Multicazoma's vassals. I think also in terms of looking at primary sources, when you look at the way the Tlaxcalteca remember Melince, she's remembered very prominently, and she's given a lot of attention in the tapestries and the artwork. And when you look at the Spanish sources, it's just the opposite. Cortés downplays her presence a lot. In his letters to the king, he makes only passing reference to her. And I think that the prominence that Melince gets in Mesoamerican sources speaks to how big a role she played in those translations, and that is oftentimes a role bigger than the Spanish wanted to acknowledge, which could perhaps come from sometimes maybe she wasn't doing exactly what the Spanish wanted her to do. It's a different historical events that interest me. I think that I will probably write about the Anlishan Revolt at some point. It just depends upon how much time I have. That would probably also be a three-part series. I also really find the post-colonial history of Ghana very interesting, and I am very likely going to start working on a book about Jerry John Rawlings and Kwame Nkrumah, either in 2020 or in 2021. If all goes well, the next book of the Tenochtitlan Trilogy comes out next year.